Hello, everybody. We are back with Sunny Stroeer. If you guys listen to, this is our third time with Sunny on the pod. So there's a couple you guys can go back and reference, and we will link those in the show notes. But if you are tuning in now, I do encourage jumping back to the last podcast we just did with Sunny, which was preparation conversation for her Arizona Trail mission. And now we're touching base post Arizona Trail, and we're going to dive into how everything went, how she's feeling, what happened out there, all that good stuff. So thank you again, Sunny, for joining us.
Thank you, Kyla, for having me back.
So how many days has it been since you came off the trail?
I came off 3 days ago, 72 hours ago. And, spoiler alert, I didn't do it. I decided to come off the trail at mile 208.5, if you're
Gosh.
going to be specific.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
yeah, I didn't end up pushing through to completion, which would have been another 600 miles. But I had a week out there that it was a really good adventure. It
Hmm.
was pretty impactful in terms of some of the lessons that I learned.
Mm.
And in the end, I just realized that I didn't want to be out there anymore. So I
Yeah.
quit.
Yeah. Have you um have you ever experienced that feeling before in any of your outdoorness, outdoor adventures?
That's a good question. I was actually thinking about that and talking about it with Paul, my husband. I don't think I've ever had it quite that salient. I mean, there's certainly
Mm.
moments, where I'm like, oh, wow, this is silly. Why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
But typically, I thrive on, taking on these big challenges, and I really thrive on the discovery and the uncertainty element. And I think part of what happened out there actually was that things ended up working out so well that I was like, like
Yeah.
it's not that difficult right now. Like all I have to do is walk for 15 hours a day, which I know that I can do. And so
Yeah.
that, things were going so smoothly that mentally I just wasn't as engaged and as in the
Mm.
moment as I had hoped to be. And I decided that I didn't want to spend another 2 weeks just, walking 15 hours a day just to prove the point that I could walk 15 hours a day, which I know that I can do.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's all in all. It sounds like it was almost like, yeah, uneventful to some degree, because everything was going well, which is, I think, a good thing, right? I mean, at first, to some degree, right? So to kind of jump back a little bit, for where we left off with our last recording, kind of bring us to the beginning of the journey. So when did you end up taking off? What was your starting pack weight? Walk us through that.
So I started at the border between Utah and Arizona, which is just about an hour from my house, on the 11th of November in the end, which was a little bit later than I had wanted to. I actually set out once on the 9th, and that
Mm.
ended up being a false start because I had equipment failure within the first 10 miles. That was so radical that I ended up having to come off the trail and reset. And, for what it's worth, we had touched on this a little bit, but I was attempting to hike the trail in, the fastest known time in unsupported style, which meant that I had to carry everything that I needed from the very start, including all of my food, which of course
Mm.
is the reason that, we've been working together to figure out
Mm.
how to actually do that because food for 800 miles weighs a lot. And
Yeah.
the more you have to carry, the more calories you burn, the harder you work, the
Hmm.
less likely you are to finish. Anyway, so the whole premise of the thing was that I had a ton of weight with me.
Hmm.
I was at, during my first attempt, I was at 65 pounds on the dot,
Hmm.
which is, the attempt where my trekking pole ended up breaking in the first 10 miles and I decided to reset. What you have to know there is the reason that a broken trekking pole was a huge deal on this is because I wasn't carrying all of my weight. I was
Mm.
actually wheeling part of it behind me, and my trekking poles were my connectors to my little cart contraption
Right.
that allowed me to move efficiently with that amount of weight.
Wow.
So yeah, 9th of November was the first attempt, 65 pounds, trekking pole broke in the first 10 miles. I bailed,
Mm.
came back home and tinkered a little bit more and decided to reset. And then I made a couple of changes over the next 2 days. I ended up rigging my cart and my wheeled contraption a little bit differently with two
Mm.
sets of trekking poles rather than just one.
Mm.
I also changed around the weight distribution between what I did carry on my back versus what I
Mm,
had on the cart. Where to start with, I think I had almost 50 pounds on the cart and like
mm,
15 on my back.
wow.
I ended up shifting that to carry about 35 between my
Mm,
backpack and the cart.
hmm.
And I switched around part of the carrying system as well, and that I upgraded to a beefier, more cushioned backpack that
Mm,
would allow me to carry more comfortably for the stretches where I wasn't allowed to use wheels. So
yeah. Wow. Gosh. And I mean, what a contraption. Has anybody ever done something similar? Do you know?
I'm not aware of anybody using carts on a trail in the US,
Mm,
but the way I got set up with the system was that I realized early on in training that carrying, 70 pounds over these really long days, like 40-mile days, is possible from a strength perspective, but just structurally, on your hip bones and the chafing and
yeah.
everything, it's really, really, really painful and really difficult.
Yeah.
And every day just gets worse and worse and worse. So I realized in training that I wanted to do whatever I could to avoid that
Mm,
and started looking around. And I actually found a guy in Australia, Chris from Trekker's Friend, who
mm,
had built this little contraption and who had tinkered with this sort of solution and had good success, for himself and with some other folks who had used it on long treks in
wow.
Australia and New Zealand. And yeah, I, bought a unit and had it shipped over from Australia and started playing around with it, and it worked out pretty well.
That's awesome. And when you say sections that you could use the wheels on, is it like only sections that allow bikes that you can have wheels, or is it just the type of terrain?
It's a little bit of both, but it's primarily the question of, where bikes are not permitted. So there's
Mm,
quite a bit of wilderness travel on the
mm,
Arizona Trail, and then the Grand Canyon rim to rim section, where you're in the canyon below
mhm.
the rim, that doesn't allow any mechanized travel, which includes wheels. So at that point,
Gotcha.
you can carry your bike or
Hmm.
your cart, but you can't have it on the ground. And of course, I knew that because the Arizona Trail specifically actually has a pretty famous bike race on it,
Oh,
that goes the length of the Arizona Trail. So I knew that a lot of that trail is open to wheels and to biking,
nice.
but then
Hmm.
there are about 160 miles or so out of the 800 that are not permissible for wheels.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. And so was pack weight so it sounds like pack weight was a little more than 65 in the second attempt, right? Sounds like it was more like
Correct.
70.
Yeah. So when I actually started out on the 11th of November with my, improved and final system, I ended up weighing in at 72 pounds between my
Mm,
pack and my cart.
And does that include water that you're starting with too?
That did include water. That included 2 liters of water. And of course, my
Okay.
water weight kind of fluctuated, over the
Right.
course of the next week because there were a couple of stretches of terrain where I didn't have access to that many water sources. So I had to carry more than 2 liters at a time.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. All right. So day one, you get out on the trail. Well, the fish like November 11th start date. How many miles are you covering in those first couple days that you're out there?
That very first day was a warm-up day for me, and I didn't start until 11:30 in the morning. So I was
Okay.
intended to be a half day. I ended
Hmm.
up doing 22 miles the first day with I think almost 2,500 feet of climbing because I had to
Wow.
climb from the start of the trail, up onto the North Kaiba Plateau on the north of the
Mm,
Grand Canyon. And it worked out pretty well. So,
awesome.
first day, warm up, 22 miles. I think it took me 7.5 hours or so, 8 hours
Hmm.
to go do that. I was in bed by 8 o'clock. I'd hit my target for the day by
Hmm.
7 p.m. It was dark already. I
Hmm.
made some food, called home, killed some time, and then went to sleep pretty early.
Nice.
Then the next day I did 40 miles. And then the
Wow.
next day I had to go and cross the Grand Canyon where I had to carry, and that was really, really hard.
Oh gosh.
And
Yeah.
then I had another 40-mile day after a bit of a recovery day. So yeah, just it kind of kept on going. The intent
Yeah.
of the whole adventure was big miles every single day.
Yes. Yeah. And Sunny has shared some of her stats with us through Whoop and Garmin. And just looking at your first, I think, yeah, the Whoop is showing us 7 days here. So you did 22 miles, 40 miles, and then 37 miles. And the day you did 37 miles is like you're saying when you were carrying, and from a caloric expenditure capture, Whoop's reading her caloric expenditure closer to 4,300 calories, as opposed to 4,000 calories when she did a 40-mile day. So a bit more caloric expenditure because of obviously the carry. And was there more vert too
Yeah,
on
there
climbing
was a
down the
lot
mountain?
more vert because I had to, well, first descend about 6,000 feet, from the North Rim down to the river, to the Colorado, and then climbing back up on South Kaibab. Now, what I will say is that that data from, the day that I went through the Grand Canyon is a little bit, it's not as clean as I would like it to be, because
Mm,
essentially what had happened there is, I think I got up at 6:30 in the morning. I started my miles, which in the beginning was still pulling the cart
hmm
until I hit the rim of the Grand Canyon. So the first 17, 18 miles, I was still pulling the cart up
hmm
at elevation. Then I had to repack to go into a carrying mode. And I started down into the canyon at 2 in the afternoon. And
mm,
my intent was that I would have a, 10 to 12 hour crossing of the Grand Canyon and climb out on the other side at like 2, 3 in the morning, get out of the park and go to bed by, 4 or 5 in the morning. I didn't actually make it across the canyon until 9 a.m. the next day. So I spent a sleepless night and pulled an all-nighter carrying very, very, very slowly from the river back up to the South Rim. So I
wow.
hit Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, I think at 10 p.m. or I was there but somewhere between 9 and 10
Oh
p.m. I
my
took a
gosh.
break, had dinner, and I was thinking it should take me about maybe 5 hours with the heavy pack to climb out. And it took me almost 12. It was really, really, really hard carrying that out of there.
Wow. That was a 6,000, was that 6,000 feet?
I think it comes out to about 4,500 or so. So it's not that
Wow.
much, but it's still, with 67 pounds on your back, it's a
Oh my
lot
gosh.
after
Yeah.
already having done what, 30 plus miles for the day. And, the kicker for me was that, so I had trained with the heavy weight and I trained for descents and for climbs, but really I could feel that my muscles were just getting fatigued. And so I started having twinges in my right ACL as I was starting to
Mm-hmm.
climb back up from Phantom Ranch.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had taped it and I could still feel it. And the thing that seemed to make it better was just resting.
Mm,
So, I actually took a couple times. I took one like 30-minute break where I just kind of sat by the side of the trail and had my legs up and, listened to a podcast. And then I took a 3 hour break at tip-off point, doing
yeah.
exactly the same thing because I could feel that I needed for my muscles to reset so that I wasn't going to
Yeah.
go and risk the tendon.
Yeah. Wow. Goodness. And yeah, talking about that, like how and the sleeping too, I imagine like on the ground and with like keeping things light. How did your hips and knees and ankles and all that feel?
Outside of that incident, it all felt great. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
was really, really good. My hips were chafed, of course, coming out of the Grand Canyon with that weight.
Yeah.
Even though I only had to carry the pack for 21 miles, it hurt.
Yeah.
But the
Wow.
nice thing is that the very next day, or actually as soon as I hit the rim of the Grand Canyon, I could repack things and, rebuild my little cart contraption. And then I
hmm
had 20 pounds on my hips and the rest was in the cart, and that was great.
Wow.
And
Awesome.
the next day I did 40 miles in 15 and a half hours and felt like I could have kept going at the end of it. I just,
hmm
went to sleep because I was bored with walking on the trail
Yeah. Oh
rather
my
than because I was
gosh.
exhausted.
Are you getting any blisters?
I got a couple of small blisters
Yeah.
again from that Grand Canyon portage.
Mm.
And really just a little bit. I've developing bunions on my feet, and so the bunions
hmm
chafed a little bit, and my pinky toes got some blisters. But
hmm
outside of that, I really didn't have any issues.
Nice.
I wear toe socks, and I've been in
Yeah.
Loa boots for a long, long time. That works out really well for me.
What kind of boots?
Loa boots.
Oh, how do you spell
Yeah.
that?
Lowa. They're a German brand.
Oh,
And yeah, I've been a huge fan. I, do everything in Loas from running and hiking to, high altitude mountaineering to technical rock climbing.
cool. I have not heard of those. I will have to check those out. Loa boots. And so after that Grand Canyon day, obviously you pulled an all-nighter. So I see kind of day four, recovery rest day, 7 miles were covered. Was that 7 miles covered? Was that because it was Whoop was tracking you from probably midnight onward?
Pretty well, actually, no, if we cut it off at midnight, I think the mileage distribution would have been like 33 miles probably on
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday and then, 11 miles or so on Thursday.
Gotcha.
But what happened there is so I topped out from the Grand Canyon at 9 in the morning.
hmm
And then I had another about 7 miles to go from there to exit the park
Okay.
to where I could legally sleep.
Mm,
So, I just took my time and kind of brambled about there and, ate a
mm,
lot of food and sat in the sun and tended to my feet and,
yeah.
drank a lot and rested in between and, just walked a little bit to get out of the park and be able to sleep because
Yeah.
I knew that I needed recovery after that
Hmm.
huge effort, particularly with how my legs had been feeling, how my
Hmm.
ACL had been feeling.
Yeah. Wow. How, tell us about the water. Like, I know this is one of the things we were talking about in our last episode is like, we're carrying obviously all the food from start, but you can get water from certain locations. And what was that like in these days? Like, where were you getting the water from?
Yeah, so you're allowed to get water in this type of unsupported effort from natural sources and from public spigots,
Mm,
which means that I could fill up from, like wildlife drinkers and lakes and streams and
hmm
spigots, at campgrounds in the Grand Canyon when those were
hmm
open and whatnot. And in general, that worked out relatively well. I tried to be pretty good and mindful, having talked with you a bunch about dehydration and the risks thereof. I think I was drinking about 4 to 5 liters a day for the
hmm
most part. But then I got into a long stretch after I'd climbed out of the Grand Canyon, between the Grand Canyon and Flagstaff. You traverse this area called Babbitt Ranch, and there isn't water for up to 40 miles at a time.
Wow.
So for that, I was carrying, yeah, I would fill up at a water source and then I would carry 5 liters, which is what,
Hmm.
11 pounds, and
Wow.
just have that with me. And I know that there were probably 1 or 2 days where I was a little on the dehydration side because I just,
Yeah.
didn't have more access.
Right. And what was the weather like for the time you were out there?
It was cold. It
Yeah.
was definitely cold. And that was part of my gamble for what it's worth, because the Arizona Trail is complicated in that it traverses high country, particularly in the north, where you're up
Mhm.
at, 8,000, 9,000 feet above sea level. And then as you get further south, there's still some mountain ranges that you have to go across, and you go across Mount Lemmon and Tucson and all of those places where
Mm,
you're up high. But there's also a lot of low elevation Arizona desert in between. That's like between the 3 and 5,000 foot elevation range, which tends
mm,
to be really, really hot, right? So I deliberately started in early November because I was betting on being able to make it through the high country before the first snow, hopefully, and
mm,
before, real bad cold moved in, and then drop down into the lower elevations and have great temperatures for big mileage, with
hmm
cooler days and manageable nights. What actually ended up happening was that the time on the Kaiba Plateau in particular was very cold. There were a couple of days where I was just hiking in my big puffy jacket, even, as I'm putting down the miles.
Wow.
And it was manageable, but I had a lot of nights where I had to worry about keeping my water unfrozen. That was another reason, for the dehydration, because sometimes when I had
Hmm.
to camp in between water sources, even though I had the capacity to carry more water, I didn't really have the capacity to keep 5 liters unfrozen in my sleeping
Hmm.
bag. So
Hmm.
I just, make do with, one or two and keep those with me overnight, because anything that
Yeah.
was left outside would freeze.
Yeah, wow. And a reminder for our listeners or those who haven't listened to the first, or well, the second podcast with Sunny, but the first podcast before she took off for the Arizona Trail is you weren't bringing any heat, no cooking stove to save on weight. And so didn't have that to thaw the water either. And then that brings me to the water purification. So we were talking
Mhm.
about the method you were going to use for that. And it makes me think a lot of times when I've camped in campgrounds, they say like those spigots, they say not potable water. And so
Mhm.
usually they do want you well, I guess what if you're pulling it, you would want to treat it
Yeah.
even from those, right?
Yeah, so it depends. There's a couple of different, well, it depends on the area that you're in and it depends on the campground. The Grand Canyon has really old but mostly good water infrastructure where if the pipeline's not
Nice.
broken, it is potable water and you can just
Okay.
take it straight from the source. So that was really, really
Great.
nice. And then I did have quite a bit of, like cattle troughs and wildlife drinkers that I
Mm.
had to take from, and those, of course,
Hmm.
have to be filtered.
Yeah.
So I ended up taking with me a Catadin Be-Free filter, actually, which is slightly
Hmm.
different from what I'd mentioned in the
Mm.
last
Hmm.
episode we recorded. And I also had iodine drops for backup to be able to treat.
So do you do the filter and the iodine drops, or do you usually just do filter
Just,
and
yeah,
then,
one
yeah.
or the other was just for redundancy. And I was glad
Mm-hmm.
that I did have both because my filter started slowing down very, very quickly. I was surprised.
Mm.
I think I only got about 5 liters out of that filter despite back
Oh,
flushing and despite having had really good experiences with it in other
oh,
environments. But
yeah.
it was just, yeah, it ended up being super slow. And so by the time I reached my last couple of days on the trail, I had started to use iodine tabs instead of filtering because I was just
Mm.
getting too annoyed and it was too slow for me to filter.
Yeah. Does the iodine tabs make the water taste
Yeah.
iodine-y?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it tastes funny. I don't mind it
Yeah.
too much. It's perfectly fine. I do think that if you drink a lot of iodine water, I'm sure that has impacts, but
Yeah.
I decided to not
Yes.
about that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it makes me think because iodine is one of the big things for that has an impact on like the thyroid gland. And
Mhm.
yeah, interesting. Um, okay, so we talked about so different temps. Did you ever get snowed on?
I did get snowed on going across the San Francisco Peaks, which is the high country
Mm,
right before Flagstaff. I had a day of snow and sleet, and then I also had to traverse old snow patches from the very first snow of the season, both on the North Kaibab and the San Francisco Peaks, which was not ideal because, with my direction of travel, I was going from north to south and I was
hmm
going, up the mountains. So
hmm
anytime that I was going up a hill, I was on the north aspect, which would
Right.
have old snow patches,
Yeah.
and trying to drag a cart through snow
Mm,
uphill. It's
yeah.
it's not ideal, but it was still
Yeah.
more efficient, I think, and less onerous than trying to have all of that weight on my back.
Wow. Yeah, gosh. Okay, so you're out there. We talked about nutrition game plan going in. What ended up being some of your foods that you ended up using and sticking with?
So I ended up taking 4,500 calories a day
Mm.
on the dot.
Hmm.
And that was two freeze-dried meals that I'd be able to cold soak. One of them was a biscuits and gravy from Peak Refuel, and the other one was
Yum.
typically a like pasta marinara with meatballs,
Right.
each of them about 1,000 calories.
Yeah.
And then I also took a lot of nuts
Hmm.
and I took, a couple of chocolate covered pretzels and candy
Mm.
bars and that sort of thing to supplement around the margin. But
Hmm.
it was really primarily those freeze-dried meals and nuts that were providing the majority of my fuel.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. I mean, it was wild. I
Yeah.
feel like I unlocked this new superpower because I ate what I needed to eat every day. And on the bigger days that I had, I pretty much, I would finish my last morsel of food ration for the day a mile or two before camp
Mm.
and go to bed not hungry,
Yeah. Oh,
having
good.
eaten
That's awesome.
4,500 calories and
Yeah.
get up the next morning and do it all over again. And I felt great.
Amazing.
So that was really cool.
Yay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, we for our listeners, and I think we maybe touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but we ran a nutrient analysis on what Sunny was planning on taking to assess the nutrient quality and see if we were missing the mark anywhere. And did you end up doing any beef jerky or the dried mangoes?
Yes, so I did bring beef jerky, that we had discussed, and I supplemented with that. And it was interesting because I was a little skeptical to start with on that.
Hmm.
One, just from a flavor profile and whether or not I
Oh
was
yeah.
going to like it, but two, also being able to keep that fresh and unspoiled because they
Right.
do go bad once you open the
Yeah.
packaging, and I'd seen that once or twice before on trips. So
Hmm.
I ended up bringing some in a way that was relatively food safe, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I was craving them. I wasn't expecting
Ah,
it, but I had like 2 jerky sticks a day, and that was
yeah.
oftentimes the first thing that I'd eat in the morning because I'm like, yes, I
Ah.
want that jerky.
Yeah,
So
awesome.
yeah, that was great.
That's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think when we were doing your report, or analysis, one of the things I think that was coming, I want to say it was vitamin A, maybe.
Mm,
And so we were looking for sources. We were trying to find a jerky that had liver in it,
yeah,
for our listeners, but there's some out there, but we couldn't get it
yeah,
in time, right? And
yeah,
but liver is incredibly nutrient
yeah,
dense. But from a macronutrient lens too, we were making sure we were in the right place from a protein, carbohydrate, and fat
yeah,
lens for what you were doing. And yeah, it sounds like we were in a good place. And then looking too at the data you shared with the Garmin, I mean, it's reporting like 100% aerobic, as opposed to any anaerobic, at least for the day you shared,
yeah,
which means we're we're able to utilize the majority, not the most we will use from fats of all our kind of efforts is when we're doing that in an aerobic space. So yeah, I think we're in a good place there. And then with the um digestion and all that, that felt okay and going
Yeah,
from
that felt really good.
yeah,
I'd been a little bit concerned to start with, to see if I was going to
right.
be regular or not, and it worked out great. I had no
Awesome.
issues whatsoever. And, from a flavor profile as well, and just from a like food availability perspective,
Hmm.
the nuts to me were a huge winner. It was amazing. I just have them in my hip belt essentially, and
Yeah.
be snacking throughout, and that
Hmm.
was amazing. And with the freeze-dried meals, initially what I'd figured is, I'd get up in the morning, I'd probably pre-hydrate my breakfast and then eat in bed essentially, and then hit the trail and get
Yeah.
going. What
Yeah.
ended up happening was that I would eat the freeze-dried meals on the go as well
Mm.
as
Hmm.
snacks essentially, because it was just too time consuming for me to sit there and try
Yeah.
to eat one of those in a single go, right? So
Right.
instead of doing that, I just get up, get going, start out the day with jerky and nuts, just rehydrate my stuff, and then
Hmm.
yeah, eat a meal over the course of like 2 or 3 hours just by stopping every 20, 30 minutes, taking five
Yeah.
bites and doing it
Wow.
there. And that's how I came into camp at night, which
Yeah.
also saved time because I didn't have to sit there and try and eat my dinner or whatnot before bed. I was just eating as I was going, and as soon as I
Yeah.
stopped, I rolled out my sleeping bag, got into bed, and went to sleep.
Nice. That's great. Did you ever get any flavor fatigue? Like, were you ever bored of the biscuits and gravy or the marinara or
Yeah, I mean, I got to a point where I'm like, okay, this is definitely functional. I'm not necessarily enjoying eating it, but
yeah.
it was perfectly fine. It was never to a point where, I started to gag or anything like that. I
Yeah.
mean, I was also only a weekend, right? So if I had kept
Yeah.
going, I would have had another 2 weeks of
Mm.
doing exactly the same thing. But I think I am pretty good at being a monotonous eater, and
Yeah.
particularly for something like this where I know that food is literally just fuel
Hmm.
to get me through. I'm grateful to have the calories, and I don't necessarily care too much about the flavor
Yeah.
profile. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, it makes me think of like some of the athletes I work with and I mean, granted the sport, like a cyclist, right? They're like going for 100 miles, like max effort, and they have to eat the same thing for every hour on the hour for 7 hours. And yeah, that like the flavor fatigue can really set in. But imagine doing it for our listeners for 3 weeks or 20 days, of the same thing. Yeah, that's it's pretty
You know,
incredible.
what I will say is, so I had nuts for my kind of daily snacks, right? Supplemented with some other stuff. And I did have a whole lot of different types of nuts. And rather than putting them all together, mixing them up, and having a daily like mixed nuts assortment,
Mhm.
I actually kept them separate. And I
Oh,
had
nice.
my little baggies prepackaged for each day. But so I didn't know what I was going to grab. I didn't know if it was going to be almonds or peanuts or walnuts
Mm.
or, something else. And I think that helped a little bit because
Hmm.
it just, yeah, it was a little bit different, even though it was all nuts, the
Yeah.
flavor itself was a surprise every day. And it wasn't
Hmm.
exactly the same as what I'd eaten the previous day.
That's good. I think that's a good way to do that because, yeah, it does give you that kind of like surprise variety and gives you a little bit of different flavor and they're not all meshed into one big
Yeah.
bag. I like that. And the variety is great too from a micronutrient lens. I mean, yes, nuts from a macronutrient will always contain a little bit more fats and all that, but they're all going to have slightly different micronutrient values, and that helps give you kind of cover more of your bases essentially by having that variety there. So, and did you like toasted salted nuts or raw salted, or how'd you do that?
Where I could, I use salted nuts, to help with the electrolytes,
Yeah.
and but I essentially just grabbed whatever I could from the supermarket, which was
Yeah.
mostly yeah, either toasted salted or just toasted.
Awesome. Great. I love that. Okay, so we have our data here, and the long was it well, you did the one all-nighter. That was longer than 15 and a half hours, I imagine, right?
Yeah, that ended up being well,
Yeah.
I mean, I started at 7 in the morning, on Wednesday, and I topped out the Grand Canyon at 9 a.m., but I didn't really go to sleep until 5 p.m. that afternoon because it just kind of
Wow.
ambulated, very slowly from topping out to
Yeah.
where I could actually sleep.
Gosh. Okay, so when you got off the trail, like I know we're jumping ahead, but did you just go straight to bed or what what did you
Um,
do?
I did, but here's the thing. I wasn't exhausted.
Yeah.
and this kind of goes into the whole story of why I quit, right? But
Mm.
I wasn't physically exhausted. And
Hmm. Hmm.
every day, except for the crossing of the Grand Canyon, except for that all-nighter, I was sleeping between 6 and 9 hours a day, a
Nice.
night.
Yeah.
And I would wake up in the mornings, rested before my alarm rang, ready to go,
That's awesome.
and just didn't want to get out of my sleeping bag because it was cold.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so I did sleep once I came off the trail. I decided to quit Sunday evening
Hmm.
and got a hotel in Flagstaff, and
Hmm.
I obviously slept there, but like, yeah, I wasn't exhausted.
That's great. That's awesome. Did you feel like it was a good mental break or almost maybe too long of a mental break?
It, that part's interesting because I've been really looking forward to being on the trail and being away from kind of
Hmm.
the daily stressors and what
Yeah.
life looks like in general.
Hmm.
And it was really nice to be able to just be out there and be very focused and in the moment for a couple of days. And at the same time, I realized relatively quickly that instead of feeling engaged and feeling focused and feeling free, I was feeling bored and
Mm.
I was feeling like I was spending my time on something that just wasn't the right thing to be spending that time on.
Yeah. Yeah. Shoot. Okay, so that kind of takes us to we're off the trail now. Let me scroll down to my questions I had for you. Um, is there any thoughts on a potential repeat in the future of the Arizona Trail or another like what's on the radar for you, you think?
So that's a great question. And I've been talking about this with Paul, my husband, quite a bit. I'm certainly not going back on the Arizona Trail this season, right? It's getting
Right.
too late. Winter is coming.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I'll be doing it in the spring either. I have other plans. Here's the thing, and this probably sounds incredibly arrogant. I kind of feel like between the nutrition strategy and the wheels, I figured out how to do this. Like I
Yeah.
know how to do this. And it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be covering those first 200 miles.
Mm.
It was just a lot more monotonous.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, I hate just spewing hot air and being like, oh, I can do this, I'm not actually doing it. So that's a motivator for me to potentially say, okay, you know what, I will come
Mm.
back and I will go and get it done.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if my head and my heart weren't in it this time, something really would have to change
Yeah.
for me to feel differently about that next time, right? So
Hmm.
I'm not saying that I'll never get back onto the Arizona Trail, but I do think that at least in the near term and the next, 1 to 2 years, I have other adventures and other goals and other big
Hmm.
missions that
Hmm.
fill my cup a lot more
Yep.
than the Arizona Trail itself. Now, I still would really like to see the southern portion of the trail because I haven't seen that yet. And, for
Oh
what it's
yeah.
worth, and as added context here, right, I tried to run the Arizona Trail in supported style, really lightweight
Oh
last
gosh.
year, and dropped out after
Oh,
300 miles
oh,
with a stress fracture, right? So I'd
that's
already
right.
been on all of those miles that I just
Yeah.
did last week.
Yeah.
And every time I came past the spot, I was like, oh, last year I had this person with me and they were pacing me. My crew were here and we are talking about this and talking about that. And just, the whole time, one, I already knew the miles, and two,
Yeah.
I felt sad and lonely and not like
Mm.
I was really loving it.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, if I were to go back to do the trail again,
Hmm.
who knows what style I would want to do it in. But
Yeah.
also, the getting to the south, the
Hmm.
last 500 miles down towards Mexico, which I still haven't seen,
Hmm.
that I'm really, really curious about. But the reality is, I'd really like to see those miles and see the
Hmm.
landscape and enjoy them and see them
Hmm.
in daylight rather than spending, in a
Yeah.
fall attempt, I'm spending a third of my time on the trail each day in the dark, not actually
Right.
seeing what I'm going past. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So I almost think that I'm more likely at this point to go back on the Arizona Trail casually without trying to set any sort of
Yeah.
record and just
Yep.
hike the southern portion because I want to see it and because I want to enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me think, Amanda, do you remember we had oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. The guy who did the Tahoe Rim, didn't he do the Tahoe Rim Trail? And then he was talking to us about was it him who did they were like debating on what time of year to do the attempt at, and they ended up choosing the year where there was the time of year that was the most daylight hours, and they ended up doing better, right? Was that correct, Amanda? Do you remember?
Yeah, yeah, I think that you're right. I think it's Adam Kimball.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're exactly right. He decided on having more daylight,
Yeah.
and he did really well with it.
Yeah.
That's right. We can link it so we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's the interesting thing because the current record holder, Anish, who's
Mm,
amazing, she did her speed hike in the spring, just of this
mm,
year actually. And so the way the Arizona Trail works out with the weather and the elevation profile, in the spring, you kind of have to go south to north. In the fall,
right.
you have to go north to south. I mean, do
Mm,
you really have to? I guess I could pressure test that a little bit more, but in general, that's the way the seasons work out and the way that it
yeah.
makes sense.
Hmm.
If you go south to north, you can't take wheels, or at least it doesn't make any sense
There's
because
so much
there,
snow.
well, it's not even snow, but it's the fact that the wilderness areas where the wheels are prohibited
Mm.
are much more concentrated in the southern portion. So
Oh.
essentially, if you can't take wheels because you have to carry everything in the south anyway, and then it doesn't
Mm.
make sense to have wheels for later on when you're already lighter, right? So the wheels are very
Oh.
much a north to south type of thing, which mandates,
Yeah.
I think, a fall hike, which
Yep.
means short days and lots of nighttime
Yeah.
hiking, you know.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Shoot.
But
Yeah. Yeah. I totally, that makes sense. I get that.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of stuff you got to think about and goes into that thought process. Um, was there any kind of nuggets you gained or insights, kind of takeaways from the attempt?
I feel like there's a lot of them actually. One
Yeah.
of them is that I'm a professional adventure athlete and I love exploring and adventures. And it can't just be any random adventure just because it's there, right? The
Mm-hmm.
Arizona Trail in so many ways made so much sense for me because it's right there and it's the right length and the right challenge and the right everything, but it just wasn't grabbing my heart.
Yeah.
And so that is a lesson that I hope I've internalized and that I think becomes more important the older I get as well, because
Hmm.
you know time's precious, and do I really want to spend 3 weeks on something
Yeah.
that I'm not that passionate about?
Hmm.
The other nugget that I took away, well, actually two nuggets, three nuggets maybe. One is caffeine specific, the run gums
Mm.
that you had recommended.
Oh, yeah.
Those worked
Yeah.
so well. I mean, that's how
Yeah.
I got through the all-nighter in the Grand Canyon. But in
Yes.
general, I would save those until late in the day
Mm.
and, kind of go and use them right around the time that it got dark and that,
Yeah.
my motivation really slumped usually, and it made a
Yeah.
huge difference with
Oh,
me.
nice.
Um,
Good.
so yeah, very different mental boost from what I had anticipated because really, we had discussed bringing them just because I was worried about going through caffeine withdrawals since I usually
Hmm.
drink ample and plentiful coffee, during the day here. But so that was one. Um, Another learning that I had was just in general from a nutrition perspective.
Mm.
Uh, I think, we've talked about this before. Usually when I do these long efforts, in the past, my strategy has always been very, very carb heavy.
Mm.
And all of my adventures are kind of this, aerobic profile that you were talking about, right?
Hmm.
I'm not an all-out athlete. I'm not
Hmm.
like an anaerobic specialist. I'm low and slow and steady,
Hmm.
but I usually would take a ton of GU products and a ton of carbs for
Hmm.
days or weeks on end. And I'd one be starving. I, would be susceptible to bonking and crashing if I didn't keep the kind of constant
Yeah.
carb chain going there. And
Mhm.
once I came off the trail or off the mountain, I'd be just ravenous and
Yeah.
scarfing down donuts all day long, right?
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't happened at all.
Oh,
It,
wow.
it's been wonderful.
Yeah.
I feel energized and I feel balanced and
Hmm.
I just feel good having
Yeah.
come off this adventure. So as I said earlier, in some ways, I feel like I've unlocked a new superpower because
Mm.
for any big multi-day mission, I'm like, okay, I
Yeah.
understand now how different this can feel.
Yeah. Yeah. And for our listeners, because I know we have a lot of like cyclist listeners too, cyclists doing well, a cyclist going for like a race performance, I'm not recommending nuts. So just keep that in mind. Sunny's efforts and what
Yeah.
we analyze based off of her heart rate zones and all that stuff is very different than what a lot of my cyclists are doing from a heart rate zone. So it would be different recommendations. So make sure
But
you know. Yeah.
but see, that's exactly the point, Kyla, for me, right? Because I came into the ultra endurance and like multi-day ultra big adventure sphere through
Running.
marathons and then ultra
Yeah.
marathons and 100 miles and whatnot, where you're out there for a couple hours at a time, right? You're
Yeah.
working hard and it's a couple hours and then you're done.
Hmm.
But that's not what I do anymore.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
didn't realize how different
Mm.
the fueling strategy could or should be between those two
Yeah.
different categories, because I was like, well, if it works for a 100-mile ultra marathon, surely it's going to work for a 1,000-mile ski through Alaska, right? And
Yeah.
yes, it worked, it got me through, but
Yeah.
it felt so different from how I'm feeling right now,
Yeah.
that yeah, I'm really grateful for the insights that I've gleaned from working with you on that.
Oh, awesome. Good. Yeah. Hopefully, I mean, hopefully it just helps you crush even bigger and badder missions out there. So, oh, and my one last question. Do you know what your pack weight was when you came off the trail? Just out of curiosity.
I didn't weigh it again, but I mean, I know what I ate and I
Hmm.
know what I drank. So I should have been, hang on, I'd been out there for 7 days, which means I got rid of 14 pounds in food
Mm,
weight.
nice.
So that would have put me at what, 58 pounds.
Okay.
And I was still in a like 2 liters of water a day type of thing.
Mm,
So yeah, 58 pounds.
wow. Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah. I think just thinking about that whole trail, like you're saying, the north to south or the south to north and the wheels and the weight and yeah, all of that stuff has to be thought about. Yeah, going into all that. Okay, well, this has been so amazing, and we are going to link for our listeners, obviously the first couple of episodes we've done with Sunny, and then your blog. You wrote a blog article as you came off the trail too, so we'll link that for the listeners if they want to read a little bit more on Sunny's insights on the trail. Any final words, thoughts for our listeners or others trying to attempt, or maybe struggling with some long, steady efforts.
Well, first off, again, for long, steady efforts, I think fats are the way to go. You know,
Yeah.
look beyond the carbs. But outside of that, if there's anybody out there who wants to go and do the Arizona Trail unsupported, I think I know how to do it. And I think I'm
Yeah.
going to write a blog post about it. You know,
Nice.
with everything that I've learned,
Yeah.
it can go way faster than the current unsupported record
Yeah. I
if
think
you
so.
don't use wheels. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're spot on with that. Yeah. So cool. Well, I'm excited to see you or I mean, just people continue to crush and yeah, like break records. It's really incredible what the body can do. So yeah, kudos to you for getting out there and doing that, Sunny. I bow to you for doing what you did. So
Thank you, Kyla.
amazing work, and it's been such a pleasure. Thank you again so much, Sunny.
Thank you for having me.